70th birthday dinner, and my daughter was smiling at me the way she used to smile at her mother when she wanted something expensive. I noticed it the moment I walked into the dining room. The good china was out, candles on the table. My son-in-law had poured the wine before I even sat down. My daughter had curled her hair, small things, but I have been on this earth for 70 years, and I spent 32 of them running a civil engineering firm in Calgary. I know when a room has been staged. I sat down, I smiled back at her, and I thought, they don't know that I know. 3 weeks earlier, my accountant had called me on a Tuesday morning. I was out on the back deck, drinking coffee and watching the magpies fight over the neighbor's bird feeder. He asked me if I had recently applied for a home equity line of credit against my house on Confederation Drive. I told him I had not. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said the application had been submitted online and it listed my signature on the consent form. My signature. On a form I'd never seen. I did not panic. I thanked him, told him to freeze everything he could on his end, and I hung up. Then I sat there for a long time watching those magpies. Noisy, bold, fearless birds. They remind me of certain people. I called my lawyer that same afternoon. His name is not important. What is important is that he has handled my affairs for 19 years, and he does not rattle easily. When I explained what had happened, he was quiet in the way that means he is already thinking 4 steps ahead. He told me not to confront anyone yet. He told me to come in the next morning and bring every financial document I could find. And then he said something I wrote down in the small notebook I keep on my nightstand. If someone is willing to forge your name, they are willing to do worse. Let's find out how far this goes before we show our hand. I did not sleep much that night. My daughter, I will call her by what she is to me, not by her name, because she made that choice, not me, had moved back to Calgary 18 months earlier. Her and her husband. He had lost his position at a logistics company in Toronto, something about restructuring, though the story changed slightly every time he told it. They had a condo in Kensington, but the rent was, according to my daughter, absolutely brutal. I had heard that phrase many times in the months after they arrived, absolutely brutal. The groceries, the insurance, the car payment on the truck. Her husband insisted on leasing even after the job disappeared. I had helped. Of course I had. $12,000 over 14 months, given in what I told myself were reasonable amounts at reasonable times. A check here, an e-transfer there. I am not a man who gives money and then holds it over someone's head. My late wife raised our daughter to understand that family helps family. I believed that was what I was doing. What I did not understand, what I was slow to see, was that my daughter had stopped thinking of my help as generosity and had started thinking of it as access. There is a difference. Generosity has limits. Access does not. Her husband had begun making comments over the previous summer, small ones at first, that the house on Confederation Drive was a lot of space for one person. That property values in the Southwest were insane right now. That it must be a lot of upkeep for a man my age, managing a 4-bedroom home alone. I answered each comment pleasantly and changed the subject. But I noticed. I filed it away. Then in September, my daughter sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me she was worried about me. She said I had seemed confused lately. She said I had repeated myself at her birthday dinner in August. She said her husband had noticed it too. She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as practiced concern, the kind you rehearse in a mirror. And she suggested that maybe I should talk to someone. A doctor. Just to be safe. I am not confused. I have never been confused. I wake up at 6 every morning. I do the Globe and Mail crossword before breakfast. I walk 4 kilometers along the Bow River Path 3 times a week, and I can recite the compressive strength specifications for every major bridge project I worked on in 30 years of practice. But I sat at that kitchen table, and I listened to my daughter tell me I was losing my mind. And I said, "You might be right. I'll look into it." Because I had already called my lawyer 2 days before that conversation. What followed was a quiet month of careful work. My lawyer contacted a forensic document examiner in Edmonton who confirmed that the signature on the line of credit application was a forgery. A good one, but not good enough. The application had been submitted from an IP address registered to my son-in-law's phone plan. My lawyer also discovered that someone had contacted my bank's estate planning line in late August, identifying themselves as my authorized representative and requesting information about the process for updating beneficiary designations on a registered account. That call had been made from my daughter's cell number. I sat in my lawyer's office on a Wednesday afternoon in October and looked at the printed records laid out on his desk. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was coming down over downtown Calgary. Soft and indifferent. I thought about my wife, who had been gone 4 years by then, and I thought about how she had loved our daughter without reservation, the way mothers do, the way that sometimes makes it harder to see clearly. She would have been devastated. She also would have said, "Handle it properly." I intended to. My lawyer had already engaged a private investigator, a woman who had spent 12 years with the RCMP before going independent. She was thorough and completely unremarkable to look at, which I gathered was a professional asset. Over the following 6 weeks, she documented 3 additional attempts by my son-in-law to gather information about my assets. He had contacted my investment advisor's office twice, each time claiming to be calling on behalf of me. The advisor had not given him anything, but had noted the calls. The investigator also found that my son-in-law had consulted on 2 separate occasions with a lawyer in Red Deer who specializes in adult guardianship applications. Guardianship. That was what they were building toward. They were going to argue I was mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. They were going to ask a court to hand control of my finances, my house, my registered accounts, the proceeds from the sale of my firm to my daughter, and once that was in place, I would have had very little ability to stop whatever came next. I thought about that a great deal over those weeks. I thought about it on my morning walks. I thought about it while I made dinner alone in the kitchen my wife had chosen, with the subway tile she picked out herself from a showroom on 17th Avenue. I thought about what kind of person looks at their aging father and sees not a human being, but a problem to be managed and a resource to be extracted. I did not come to a satisfying answer. I am not sure one exists. What I did come to was a plan. My 70th birthday fell on a Saturday in late November. My daughter had offered to organize a dinner. "Just family," she said, "somewhere nice, your choice." I suggested we do it at the house. She seemed surprised by that. I told her I wanted to cook, that it had been too long since I'd done a proper dinner for people I cared about. She agreed, and she offered to help with the dessert. Her husband offered to bring wine. Of course he did. I spent that Friday preparing 2 things: a roast beef tenderloin with horseradish cream and roasted root vegetables, which my wife used to make every Christmas, and a manila envelope which I placed in the top drawer of my desk in the study. My lawyer arrived at 6:15, 45 minutes before my daughter and her husband. I had also invited 2 witnesses, my accountant and my oldest friend, a man I have known since we were both in our 20s working summer construction in Lethbridge. These were not social invitations. They knew why they were there. My daughter walked in at 7 and seemed genuinely pleased with the house, the table, the smell of the roast. She hugged me and said I looked wonderful. Her husband shook my hand and presented the wine with the energy of a man who believes presentation covers a great many things. We ate. I opened the wine. I was relaxed because I had nothing left to be nervous about. The hard part, the 6 weeks of documentation, the cold mornings reading investigative reports, the afternoon I sat alone in my car outside the forensic examiner's office in Edmonton and let myself feel what I actually felt for about 10 minutes before driving home. All of that was behind me. After dinner, when my daughter started clearing plates, I asked everyone to stay seated. I said I had something I wanted to share on the occasion of my 70th birthday. My daughter looked at her husband. He looked at his wine glass. I went to the study and retrieved the envelope. I sat back down at the head of the table and I laid out what my lawyer and the investigator had found. I did not raise my voice. I did not editorialize. I let the documents speak, because documents, unlike people, do not revise their stories under pressure. I placed the forensic report on the forged signature in front of my son-in-law. I placed the phone records, the calls to my bank, to my investment advisor, in front of my daughter. I placed the record of his 2 consultations with the guardianship lawyer in the center of the table where everyone could see it. My daughter said my name. Then she said I was misunderstanding things. Then she said the signature issue was a misunderstanding. that her husband had thought he had my permission. Her husband said nothing. He had gone the color of the tablecloth. My lawyer, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, slid a second document across to them. It was a formal notification that a criminal complaint had been filed with the Calgary Police Service regarding the fraudulent credit application. A detective had already been in contact. There was also a civil notice, a claim for damages, and a restraining order preventing either of them from contacting my financial institutions, my accountant, or my lawyer directly. My daughter started to cry. I have seen my daughter cry at movies, at weddings, at the end of long arguments when she realized she had gone too far. I know what her real crying looks like, and I know what the other kind looks like. This was the other kind. Her husband pushed back from the table and said this was insane, that I was his wife's father and that family didn't do this to family. I found that statement genuinely interesting, given the circumstances. I told him that was exactly right. Family doesn't do this to family, and then I asked both of them to leave my home. They left. My son-in-law knocked over his wine glass on the way out, whether by accident or not, I still don't know. The wine spread across the tablecloth my wife had bought in Portugal in 2009. I stood in the doorway of the dining room for a moment, looking at that stain, and then I went to the kitchen and got a cloth. The following months were not easy, and I will not pretend they were. The police investigation moved at the speed these things move at, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paperwork. My son-in-law retained a lawyer. My daughter sent me 3 emails in January that I forwarded to my lawyer without responding to. The second one accused me of destroying the family. The third one suggested I was acting out of grief over her mother's death and that I needed help. I read that third email twice. Then I went for a walk along the river. The credit application fraud resulted in charges against my son-in-law in the spring, 1 count of fraud over $5,000 and 1 count of forgery under the criminal code. The Crown prosecutor told my lawyer the evidence was straightforward. He ultimately took a plea. He received a conditional sentence and 2 years of probation, with conditions that included no contact with my financial affairs. The conviction will follow him. My daughter was not charged criminally. The evidence tied the act of fraud to her husband's accounts and devices, and while I believe she knew, knowing and proving are different things. But the civil proceeding established clearly what had been attempted, and the judgment is part of the public record. They separated 8 months after the dinner. I do not know the details, and I did not ask. My daughter called me in September, 14 months after that birthday, and asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed. We sat at a place near the university where she used to study, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She did not apologize in any complete or unconditional way. But she did say that what had happened was wrong, and that her husband had pushed for it. I listened. I did not forgive her that afternoon, because forgiveness is not a decision you make in a coffee shop. It is something that happens slowly, or doesn't. What I told her was that the door was not permanently closed, but that trust, once it has been handled the way she handled mine, is rebuilt in actions over years, not in words over coffee. She nodded. She looked out the window at Crowchild Trail. I paid for the coffee and drove home. The house on Confederation Drive is quiet in a way that used to bother me and now mostly doesn't. I have started cooking properly again, not just reheating things, and on Saturday mornings I drive out to the farmer's market at Curry Barracks and spend too long talking to the man who sells smoked fish about topics that have nothing to do with smoked fish. I had dinner last month with my old friend from Lethbridge, and we talked for 4 hours about everything and nothing, in the way that only people who have known each other for decades can manage. My lawyer helped me restructure my estate properly after everything's settled. The house is held in trust now. The accounts have designated beneficiaries that cannot be changed by a phone call. If anyone ever again claims to act on my behalf, there is a protocol in place and it does not involve them. I turned 70 on a snowy Saturday in November, and my daughter and her husband sat at my table and smiled at me and thought I didn't know. I have spent 50 years learning that the most useful thing a person can be in any difficult situation is the quietest person in the room. I was very quiet that night, and I was ready. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from realizing that someone you loved completely was calculating the whole time. I have thought about that a great deal in the months since everything settled. Not with bitterness exactly. Bitterness is exhausting, and I am 70 years old, and I have better things to do with my mornings. But I think about it honestly, the way you think about a structural failure in a building you designed. You go back to the drawings. You find where the load-bearing assumption was wrong. You understand it, not to punish yourself, but so it does not happen again. What happened to me was not random. My daughter and her husband did not stumble into fraud. They made a series of deliberate choices, each one slightly worse than the last, and each one made easier by the one before it. That is how these things work. A small dishonesty becomes a larger one. A boundary crossed without consequence becomes an invitation. I do not say this to excuse what they did. There is no excusing it, but because understanding the pattern is the only thing that gives it any meaning at all. What I keep coming back to is this. Integrity is not something you perform when people are watching. It is the thing that holds you together when no one is watching, and you could get away with it. My son-in-law looked at my signature, decided it was close enough, and submitted a fraudulent application against a man who had never been anything but decent to him. He told himself a story about it. I am sure he did. Some version where I owed them this, where they were just taking what was fair. People always have a story. The story is how they sleep. I had a story too. Mine was built on evidence and documented in a manila envelope, and it held up in court. There is something I want to say carefully because I do not want it to sound like boasting. The reason I survived what my daughter and her husband attempted was not luck. It was because over 50 years of professional life, I had trained myself to think clearly under pressure, to document everything, to ask good questions before making decisions, and to never confuse what I hoped was true with what the evidence actually showed. Those habits did not feel like armor when I was building them. They just felt like how a serious person works. But they were armor. They were exactly that. I also want to say something about the 6 weeks I spent gathering that evidence while sitting across from my daughter at dinners and answering her calls and listening to her ask how I was sleeping. That was the hardest part. Not the legal proceedings, not the morning I read the investigator's report. The hardest part was continuing to function, to cook, to walk, to be a reasonable person in the world while carrying something that heavy. That takes a kind of endurance that nobody warns you about. You just find out whether you have it. It turns out I did. I do not know what my daughter will become. She's still young enough to choose differently. But I know that the version of herself she was building, the one that looked at an aging father and saw an opportunity, that version had nowhere good to go. Actions accumulate. The person you were at 40 is built from the choices you made at 30. There is no escaping that arithmetic. What I hope for anyone who finds something of themselves in this story is that you do not wait until someone forces your hand to take your own life seriously. Document your affairs. Know your assets. Build relationships with lawyers, with accountants, with old friends from Lethbridge who will sit at your table on a November evening without being asked twice. These things are not pessimism. They are what a person with clear eyes does. I drove home from that coffee shop on Crowchild Trail in September, and I made dinner, and I sat by the window with the lights of the city coming on one by one, and I felt not happy exactly, but solid. Like a building that has been properly inspected and found sound. That feeling is worth protecting.